Mr. President, I'd like to spend a few moments talking about why my colleagues and why the American people should be supportive of this very important legislation, historic legislation that we're debating now on the Senate floor. And it's particularly historic for my state, the great state of Alaska. But, Mr. President, there's been a lot of misinformation on this bill, and we're seeing the debate, a robust debate, which is fine. I don't need to repeat all the arguments on both sides, but I will say that my colleagues on the other side have seemed to focus on one particular point. They're coming down here, and they're making this point again and again and again. And that's the point that this bill will supposedly raise taxes on the middle class. We're hearing it. Everybody's saying it. Well, Mr. President, the problem with that argument, it's just fundamentally untrue. And the truth will be in the paychecks of the American people that they'll see in a few months. So, let me just talk about some of the provisions that are in the bill. The bill will be a middle-class tax cut for the vast majority of Americans. Here are some of the provisions. These are in the bill. These are the facts. The bill doubles the standard deduction. For an individual, the standard deduction goes from $6,300 to $12,000. For a married couple, it goes to $12,700 to $24,000. That's in the bill. That's important for middle-class families. It doubles the child tax credit. The child tax credit is doubled from the current $1,000 to $2,000, so more parents can claim it. That's in the bill. That's a fact. And it lowers rates. In fact, it not only lowers rates for middle-income Americans, it lowers rates on every single income bracket in the IRS code. That is a fact. Bottom line, Mr. President, an average family of four making $75,000 a year will have about $200 more per month in take-home pay under this bill. $2,400 a year. A single parent making $41,000 a year will see their tax bill decrease by $1,300. That is a 73% decrease. That's a fact. It's in the bill. And let me mention, Mr. President, one other critical way in which this tax bill will bring middle-class and working-class tax relief. It will get rid of the very regressive and unfair individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act. Mr. President, about 20,000 hardworking Alaskans and over 6 million Americans have to pay a tax, a penalty to the IRS for not buying something, health insurance, that they cannot afford. Let me repeat that. They are penalized for not buying something that they can't afford. Think about the absurdity of that. And here's the thing, why this is such an important middle-class tax cut when we get rid of that penalty. Close to 80% of the Americans, the 6 million Americans who pay the Obamacare individual mandate tax, close to 80% of them make $50,000 or less. Think about that. But tonight we're getting rid of that tax, that unfair penalty, and that will undoubtedly bring tax relief for the middle class. This bill also decreases taxes on small businesses and companies so they can reinvest here at home in our great nation, hire American workers, give pay raises, and help grow our economy. And, Mr. President, many of these ideas, doing these kind of things, have been bipartisan policy ideas for years. When we've talked about tax reform, let me just give you one. In 2012, President Obama said our current business tax structure hurts American businesses and inhibits growth. He said, quote, "The tax system provides tax breaks for moving jobs and profits overseas and hits companies that choose to stay in America with one of the highest tax rates in the world, unquote. That's President Obama. That's President Obama. That was true then, and it's true today. Something has to be done. And we're doing it tonight. The bill will also give small businesses and large companies a chance to help grow our economy. And Mr. President, you have heard senators after senators come down here on the Senate floor. My colleague from South Carolina has talked about this eloquently for years. It's an issue I care deeply about, but here's the issue. We've had a lost decade of economic growth. For over 10 years, we have not hit 3% GDP growth once in a year. Once in a year. Now, Mr. President, it's an issue I care deeply about. Matter of fact, I come down on the floor and I talk about it a lot. One thing that I have noticed in my 3 short years in the Senate is I'm not sure I've seen my colleagues from the other side ever come down and talk about the need to really rev up the economy. The fact that 1.5%, 2%, which was what we've had almost for the last 13 years, is not good for the country. I think, unfortunately, a lot of them believe this idea of the new normal. That America hitting at 1.5%, 2% GDP growth is America hitting on all cylinders. Well, don't believe it. We talk about GDP growth. But, Mr. President, what is that? It's really a proxy for the health of the U.S. economy. It's a proxy for the American dream. And in the last 10 years, that economy has been sick. And for millions of Americans, the American dream, which is based on a strong American economy, has been a mirage. We have to change this. This should be a bipartisan issue. Getting back to traditional levels of 3% or higher GDP growth should be something 100 senators agree on. And this bill is going to help us do that. Mr. President, finally, I'd like to talk about something in the tax bill that will greatly benefit my state and our country. And that is opening the 1002 section of the non-wilderness Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for American energy development. Now, a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have come down and talked about this. But I'm going to tell you this, Mr. President. I can't begin to describe the elation that will be felt by many, so many, in my state when this passes. The vast majority of Alaskans support this provision and have supported it for decades. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Alaskans have worked tirelessly to get it passed since the 1002 area was set aside by this body in 1980 for possible energy development. So don't believe all the rhetoric about, oh, that area is off limits. That area is actually on limits. The Congress in 1980 said, we know there's a lot of energy there and we should look at the opportunity to explore it. Congress come back and make the call someday. So hundreds, thousands of my constituents, my fellow Alaskans, and I know some are in the gallery right now, right above me, have been working on this for decades, and I want to thank all of them. But we've been stopped. We've been repeatedly stopped. You're seeing some of the arguments, many of which are truth challenged. Let's just say that, so I'm being polite to all my colleagues. So year after year, we've tried. The last time we made a big effort on this, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle killed this provision in 2005. Now, it was a crushing evening in 2005 when this provision did not pass. It was a crushing evening for the late, great Senator Ted Stevens, particularly when the then Senate Minority Leader, Harry Reid, said killing the ANWR provision and beating Ted Stevens was, quote, one of the joys of my life. It's the former Senate Minority and Majority Leader. Well, Mr. President, voting for the provision to unlock ANWR tonight will be one of the joys of my life, and I'm certain that Ted Stevens will be joyfully watching from above, smiling. Mr. President, last month a group of Alaskans came to D.C. to testify before Senator Murkowski's Energy and Natural Resources Committee about the importance to America and to Alaska and to our communities about the energy provision in this bill. Matthew Rexford, who lives in Kaktovik, Alaska, which is a village that's actually in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, provided riveting testimony. Let me quote from that testimony. Quote, "My fellow Inupiat and I firmly believe that attempts to permanently block development in the 1002 area, an area intentionally not designated as wilderness by Congress because of its oil and gas potential, is a slap in the face to our region and its people. It's exactly the same thing as saying it's okay for everyone else in this great country to have a thriving economy, but you can't have one at all. You people living on the North Slope, you people living in Kaktovik, sorry, you can't do it." Matthew went on to talk about how responsible oil and gas development supports local communities by providing jobs, business opportunities, infrastructure investments like schools and hospitals and clinics, things that most communities in America have in abundance. We don't have that in abundance in my great state. He said the industry, quote, "has moved our people away from third world living conditions, and we refuse to go backward in time. It has provided basic services most Americans take for granted, that communities like his don't have." Mr. President, increasing domestic energy production will not only be good for my state and for communities like Kaktovik, but it will also boost our country's economy, and this is a very important point. It will strengthen America's national security. Now, my colleague from Maryland, whom I have a lot of respect for, just talked about this is going to hurt national security. I couldn't disagree with him more. Producing more energy responsibly, oil, natural gas, renewables, and making the United States the world's energy superpower once again will dramatically increase our nation's national security, and this is something we should all agree on. Mr. President, I've served in the Marines for over 2 decades, and I've served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State whose portfolio included global energy issues. I've seen how energy can be used as a tool for good, productive diplomacy, and for troublesome power grabs by our nation's foes. When we don't have to import energy from countries that don't like us, or when we have the opportunity to actually export energy, American energy, to our allies, this dramatically strengthens our nation's national security. Mr. President, you and I both sit on the Armed Services Committee, and we've heard for years from Department of Defense military and civilian leaders, whether Secretary Carter, a Democrat, Secretary Mattis, a great Marine general, they have all consistently emphasized this point. Making America the world's energy superpower will help with jobs, will help with our economy, and it will dramatically help our nation's national security. Let me conclude by telling a story that really emphasizes this point. Last year, I attended the Halifax International Security Forum. National security leaders throughout the world attended. I was in a meeting with a great national security leader of this body, Senator John McCain, where we were meeting with a senior-level Russian dissident and asked him at the end of the meeting, what more can we do in our country to help push back against the Putin regime? and the activities they're undertaking to undermine U.S. interests around the world and in our own country. What more can we do? He looked at us and said, the number one thing you can do is produce more American energy. Let me repeat that, Mr. President. In terms of national security, the number one thing we can do is produce more American energy. And we do it more responsibly, with the highest environmental standards of any place in the world. In opening the 1002 area, using those highest standards, the world's highest standards, with the most advanced technology, will produce more American energy for the betterment of my state, my constituents, but for the whole country. Mr. President, we are on the cusp of passing a bill that will put more money in the hands of the middle class, grow our economy, and fulfill a 40-year-long dream for Alaska. The might of America has always been and will always be in the ingenuity of our people, the ability for Americans to make decisions for themselves, to live their lives as they see fit, to build, to grow, to make a better tomorrow for the next generation. The American dream does not have a price tag, but it can be stymied. It can be stymied and stunted by an overbearing federal government that wants to hinder the freedom of the individual, an overbearing federal government that crushes economic hope and opportunity through overtaxation or overregulation, and it does this by telling someone like Matthew Rexford from a small village more than 5,000 miles from here that he and his people can't make a better life for themselves and for their children by developing resources on their own land. Well, Mr. President, that's going to end tonight. At long last, that's going to change. And the vast majority of Alaskans, Democrats and Republicans, native and non-native, are going to celebrate. And I believe when the American people realize and experience the positive benefits of this bill, through stronger economic growth, better jobs, more take-home pay, they're going to celebrate too. I urge my colleagues to vote for this historic legislation. I yield the floor.